Welcome to ATFN Live. So I have with me today Dick Mirgon and Kamala Kuhn. We're going to do a little talking about grants as it's related to FirstNet and other topics if we get to them. So I'd like to say good morning. How are you, Dick?
I'm pretty good. Thanks, Brent, for doing this.
Kamala, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Brent. Thank you.
Glad to have you here. And so for those of you who don't know, Kamala has quite an extensive background in grants, all kinds of them. But hopefully today we're going to talk a little bit about grants as they relate to FirstNet. Dick, do you have things you want to add before we get started and let Kamala talk?
Yeah, so again, this is just a general conversation amongst the three of us. As much as all three of us have participated as government officials in federally declared disasters, we have different points of view and different experiences. I was a county emergency manager where Kamala was the deputy chief for Nevada DEM, and she's done way more federal disaster declarations than I have. And I always said the disaster declaration was the disaster because of all the paperwork. But absent that, what comes with a federal disaster is a lot of money and the ability to pay for the disaster. And with the coronavirus out there now and COVID-19, there is a presidential declared disaster for this. And I just wanted to take some time here today to talk about how that applies at a local level, how people can use the grant, and just clear up some of the mystery and misinformation. Kamala was telling me about a grant request she got yesterday. Kamala, you want to talk about that a little bit from that vendor who was simply saying, hey, look, you can do X, but it's not true. Can you tell everybody what it was you were being briefed on and some of the realities behind that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I received as you stated, a call with regards to some information that had been put out by a company that had extracted or excerpts from the Senate bill. And unfortunately, when you do that and you put that out into the form of a public notice, it can be very misleading. And I think we have an opportunity through this chat today to maybe help and clear some of that up. One of those issues that was focused on was extracted from that bill was the Emergency Management Performance Grant, for which $100 million had been set aside for emergency management. And specifically, they were talking about this money for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments to support coordination, communications, and logistics. Well, that word communications stood out to this particular customer. And what I hope that we can clarify today is, and to help people realize, is please don't take that word at face value. In this particular case, it is for emergency management agencies nationwide. And Dick, as you and I discussed yesterday, is very possibly, and I believe you read something on this, that this money relative to communications would be for communications like public service announcements or information that would be put out by public information officers versus like communications interoperability equipment.
Right. Yeah. It was clearly intended by Congress to be able to support communicating with the public and putting out public notices and advisories and those types of things. And so here you had a technology company take out literal language and say, oh, communications, that's us. We sell communications equipment. There's 100 million added to MPG. It can be used for this. Well, it can't. That wasn't the intent. And so we'll get deep in the discussion, but as you read through this, you've got to look at the grant guidance come out of your state. So here's our first disclaimer as we talk about stuff. Every state is different. Every regional director within FEMA is a little bit different on interpretations. Kamala and I and Brent have all seen over the years where one entity was allowed to buy a blue widget, and then another entity tries to buy the same blue widget, and it was disallowed. Well, that can occur simply because of one, how you write it up. It can occur because of what your use for it is and how it's applying to the disaster, or it could occur because the granting authority, didn't see that as a allowable cost. But the primary lesson here is check with your state and find out if it's an allowable cost before you go, getting yourself in debt with purchasing whatever relating to this grant. And then also get it in writing from the regional director. And Kamala, you know more about that. I mean, is that fundamentally correct?
Yes, that is fundamentally correct. And I think when we start to talk about some of the examples, I can walk through that relatively quickly. Another example that occurred with information put out by a company was a line item for FEMA administration, $45 million. And they talk about for use for technology and communications. Again, that is not funding that's going to be readily available to state and local governments. That is specifically for the FEMA administration. So just wanting to make sure that as people move forward, that they seek the proper guidance, as you stated, Dick, from the state emergency operations centers to find out. And we're dealing with two different animals here. We're dealing with the bill that was passed by the Senate and the House. That was the stimulus bill relative to the coronavirus. And then there's the presidential declaration, which for the first time, at least in my experience, I've ever seen on a national level. Typically, presidential disaster declarations are regionalized or they're local. So this is a little bit new, but the same rules still apply when you're dealing with public assistance. In the case that we're dealing with right now in the coronavirus, the president has allowed for only Category B under emergency protective measures, which is emergency work.
So I'm going to stop you there for a moment because you said something interesting that people get confused on. Public assistance. So FEMA has different categories of grant assistance and aid assistance, and public assistance is one of those areas which applies to assistance to state and local government. So talk a moment about what's the PA portion, typically referred to as PA, the PA portion of a FEMA grant.
Okay, well, if I may, Dick, I'll clarify that typically disaster relief funding or assistance through FEMA, when you receive a presidential declaration, comes in up to 3 different funding sources: public assistance, individual assistance, and hazard mitigation assistance. The PA, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is public assistance, and it is for state, local, tribal nations in efforts to respond to and recover from a disaster or emergency. Individual assistance applies strictly to individuals to help them get back on their feet.
Has not so far applied to this declaration.
That is also correct.
Right.
Same thing with hazard mitigation assistance. It is typically a percentage of the overall public assistance amount provided to each state, and assuming that their plan is in place. But again, that is not in play right now with this one. So the only thing we're going to be talking about is the public assistance funding stream and only Category B, which is emergency protective measures. So moving on to the inquiry, which I think was a great example. The customer asked me 3 questions. 1, if a firefighter needed a new radio because his radio became inoperable or got broke, would this grant under public assistance cover that cost and the user fees related to that? So the answer is simple. Yes, it will cover the cost to replace the radio. However, with regards to the user fees, no, because those user fees are already budgeted. The only thing that it would pick up is if there's any increase in a user fee. So it would be the difference between the existing user fee and the new user fee. That would be the only part that would be eligible.
And it's only going to cover that fee during the time frame of the disaster. And again, what people need to understand, there will be dates assigned to this disaster, a start date, which I believe was April 1st. Anyway, there's a start date on the documentation, and there will be an end date, which is yet to be determined. But that's when your service fee will apply.
Correct. So during the time period to respond to and to recover from, that is the window of time that an entity can claim or request reimbursement for those fees.
Okay, so here's the other interesting thing we get into, a thing called supplanting. If you currently have existing use or needs and you've been using it, you cannot use disaster funds for it. If you have it in your budget, you cannot use disaster funds. There will be audits. Kamala and I both been through many audits, and you will have to pay that money back if you end up using it incorrectly. Now, so how does this really play out in the real world? Real world example is we find that police officers are being assigned to the protection of facilities, these new hospitals that are being put out, mobile hospitals being put out there. But let's say you've got an agency where everybody doesn't have their own device. It's a shared device. Well, now I'm putting more people in the field. I don't have enough devices to hand people. You should be able to add those devices, pay for that service with this grant because it is a direct cost related to the disaster. And again, it's a general statement, check with your state. I know we've done that before on other disasters. Any more you want to add on that example, Kamala?
Only thing I really want to add to that is that, again, emphasis placed on the user fees, even on the new units, will only be covered during the period to respond to and recover from.
Right. So you're going to be responsible for those fees. If you get something that's got a 2-year maintenance contract, you're only going to be able to charge to that disaster those months that disaster exists.
Correct.
So if you lock in, you're pretty well locked.
Right. And that was actually example number 2. So a fire agency needed 10 more radios due to deployment of firefighters out in the field. So right. that covers that one. So the third example, though, was I found somewhat intriguing. I was asked, so if a jurisdiction has a radio or a communication system that is desperately in need of being replaced because it's antiquated, is that an eligible cost? So here's what I would say to that. The bottom line is the current system currently operational? Is it sufficient to do the job? So that brings into, is it posing any risk or threat to public safety, community safety, or first responder safety? If the answers to those questions are no, I wouldn't recommend going that route. But if for some reason you've got issues with the existing communication system that are prohibiting the agency from effectively and efficiently responding to and recovering from the incident, then certainly it could be considered. However, would strongly encourage those entities that are considering such a thing to run it through the state EOC and subsequently on to, as you mentioned before, Dick, the FEMA region director. I would obtain all of that authorization if you obtain it in writing.
Okay,
because it will be audited.
So here's what Kamala and I have done for many years, and that is debate what you can and can't do with federal grants. So here's how I would write up a grant for a specific purpose. You tell me if you sitting in your state office 10 years ago would have approved it. And it's real simple. I've got a device that users have in the field that I need to be able to decontaminate it. I cannot decontaminate that device because you put any fluids on it, it stops working. But you've got Zebra, you've got Sonam, you've got Harris, Motorola that make devices you can decon. So instead of this cheap no-name device I've been using, I go exchange it for a more expensive device that I decon. I'm going to charge the expense to the grant. Is that an eligible expense from your point of view?
Well, sitting back 10 years ago, I would have looked at you first of all and said, is it not possible to add additional devices on the existing system so that everybody has their own, so they don't have to worry about the
But they had their own. But I can't decon them now. We've gone into a hazardous environment. I can't continue to, I have to wash my hands. I have to clean the device. We've seen a lot of technology about how to clean your cell phone. I can't with these older devices. Is that eligible then?
I would say run it up.
Okay,
If that's what
I would run it up to the state. I would make that argument that I cannot perform my public safety function without that device. Just like it would be the other scenario. I need to do additional applications or features on a device, that maybe you've got a Jethro Gibbs flip phone, and but you need to do something different, exchanging that so I can load an app on it, I think that's eligible.
It is. Again, though, that would probably go to the point of it being sufficient to respond and recover. So if an app is needed that is not your existing equipment is not able to handle or accept, that's a plausible argument.
Okay. So let's talk about, Brent, you look like you've got something you want to say.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm smiling because I used to sit through these when you two went back and forth years ago. But along with that, Kamala, you made a comment, and I kind of just slipped by, and I don't know if anybody listening to us or watching us caught it, but you made a comment about provided you have a plan in reference to all of this. So my question to you is, do you have to provide the plan in place that covers this in advance before the grant, or is it something that's added as you submit the grant, or how does that all come into play?
Okay,
do you have to have an emergency? Do you have to have an emergency response plan in order to apply for a grant, or is it something that can be done in conjunction with? I guess that's my question. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, Brent. Thank you, and I'm going to answer that in two parts. With regards to the emergency response plan, it's actually the emergency operations plan, and all states already have them. So what I was specifically referring to, though, was when we were talking about the three components of public assistance and the hazard mitigation assistance program specifically. Each state must have their hazard mitigation plan in place and current in order to qualify for that particular funding stream. So I apologize. I should have clarified that.
Okay, I appreciate that. Dick, you had other things you wanted to go on to?
So let's talk about grant matches. Now, most disasters, these grants are administered or are out there because of something called the Stanford Act. And that act requires that there be a match for all grants. The upside, and again, it depends on the grant and the state, soft matches. So a soft match is your additional time, the time allocated towards the disaster. In many cases, you can use volunteer time. If you've got volunteers coming in to do traffic control that's actually being applied to the disaster, there's a dollar value that's placed on that time. You need to track all the time that you work towards this disaster, partly because in some cases it's reimbursable, depending on who it is and what you're doing. That overtime can be reimbursable and salaries can, but it's that volunteer time that helps you hit that match. That if you're using volunteers, track that time and make sure that applies. So Kamala, talk a little bit about the match and generally the requirement, and then we'll start talking about some exceptions.
Okay. When you're looking at match, there's typically three different sources of match. One is a hard cash match. Let's talk about that one first. So if you have first responders out there, all of their time, as long as you're not requesting reimbursement for parts of it, all of their time can be used as matching funds. And what I mean by that is, and I want to clarify that it's only as long as their salaries and their personnel costs are not already being paid by a federal grant. It has to be government money, state government, local government. It cannot be federal grant funded positions. So that is considered a hard cash match. Or if your jurisdiction is going to appropriate a general fund match. And Dick, before I go on with that, I want to talk about the match requirement. On public assistance, the match requirement is currently at 25%. The federal government, upon certain conditions, can reduce that match requirement to 10%. But that would need to be explored under, with existing conditions and through communication with the FEMA regional director. Okay, so moving on to the second kind of match, soft or in kind. And Dick, that was one that you were describing with the use of volunteers. That as long as those hours are tracked, typically a risk management agency will have a comparable hourly rate that can be attributable to that, or to those hours, which can be calculated, and it certainly can be used as match. The other kind of match would be a third party match. That's if you've got additional agencies outside of the declared area, which under a national declaration in this case probably would not apply. But in the event that you've got third party outside of the disaster zone that maybe are offering assistance, their time can also be recorded as potential match. And again, very important, no matter what kind of match it is, document it and document it and document it, because disaster funds will be audited.
Okay, so let's talk about overmatching and sharing matchings. One of the things we've done in the past is, as a county, we had X amount of, let's say we had $1 million in match, but we only needed to match 100,000. Well, we've got 900,000 there. A lot of times we could report that to the state, and the state could allocate that to the disaster to help other people meet their match. Still apply today?
It would apply, but only if that other $900,000 is actually expended.
Right. No, right. But assuming you had one agency that didn't have a match, another agency could help make that up.
Yes, they can.
Okay. So some of these people are saying, and I'm looking at the OJP guide, and I haven't actually found it, but there's one company that I find highly reliable. They generally know the OJP, Office of Justice Programs. They're claiming that there is no requirement for a match. So have you seen some of these smaller grants which did not require a match?
Well, it depends on what we're talking about for sure, but the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant, which also received additional funding through the Senate and House, there is no match required.
Okay, so what the bill did is they allocated more money to the program. They are now passing that on to locals to help fight COVID-19. And so in that particular grant, they would not need to match that.
Correct. And the Edward Byrne Memorial JAG grant typically doesn't require a match anyway.
Okay.
So that's
but still, wouldn't it be smart for an agency to still track time? OJP applies to law enforcement and criminal justice type entities, but they are still part of a city, county, or state. They should still track all that time, and any volunteer time or overage should still be reported to whoever's administering the grant. Again, so it might be able to be applied in public works or the health department or somewhere else, which may have had a higher cash outlay and couldn't meet the match, right?
Yes. Absolutely record all of it, because as a state, as long as the match is met, the feds will typically accept that.
Okay. And one of the things I think we also need to tell folks that, you may be sitting there thinking about the paperwork. This is a disaster, and I commented earlier on about the paperwork. Don't let that stop you. The fact of the matter is, as a governmental entity, somebody in your city, county, or state is going to be doing that paperwork. So make sure you coordinate with them. You get them that information. Do not shy away from this. There's a lot of money out there to support the response. This is going to be a significant burden on state and local government that, from the world the three of us come from, that, the revenues, the taxes collected are based on sales tax and employment tax, and those revenues are going to be lower within those governmental entities. State and local need these grants to help sustain this operation, because there's going to be a lot of lost revenue in governmental entities, no matter what that source revenue is. So don't shy away from this. So let's talk a little bit about FEMA. Just in general, one of the misnomers that kind of drives me nuts, and I'd like your comment on it and thoughts on it, is that we constantly hear from people about, well, FEMA's not doing enough. Why hasn't FEMA distributed stuff? And I use the ventilators as a classic example because they're talking about, well, you know, X state wanted so many ventilators and they're not getting them because they're preparing for it. Well, that's not FEMA's job. FEMA's job is not to deliver everybody's needs all the time. FEMA's job is to deliver it when you need it. You know, I think the private sector calls it just-in-time inventory or something like that. And so their job is to stage the stuff, have it in the right places, and deliver it when you need it. Because what we know, and we have seen this time and time again, governmental entities will hoard things. We are a nation made up of states. States have the right to go out and purchase and procure their own, but we can't let any one entity stockpile and hoard something that they're not going to be using just in case they might use it. FEMA's job is to manage that resource. So you want to talk a little bit about FEMA and what they do and how they do it?
Absolutely. Let me just start by saying this. FEMA is an extraordinary agency for what they deal with and what they do every day. But I think it's clear that everybody understands all disasters begin at the local level. And that is another misnomer of the general public. The declaration process for any disaster emergency starts at the local level. What the declaration or emergency or what the disaster or emergency declaration is used for and what it was intended for is to notify the next level of government that the entity issuing that declaration has exceeded their capabilities. So they're seeking additional resources. So once it goes from a local government, typically it'll go to a county government. County will declare once they've exceeded their resources in total. And then they'll notify, when the county declares, that's notification to the state that, look, we're in trouble. We need resources. So typically a state declaration should not occur until which point in time a state has exceeded its resources and or capabilities, because that is notification to the president that that state now needs resources. So back to your point, Dick, you're absolutely right. It is the responsibility of local and state governments to ensure that they are prepared. That is what multiple years of preparedness grants have been intended for. So if a jurisdiction understands what their risks or potential threats are, then it's incumbent upon that state or those local governments to ensure that they have the proper resources in the form of preparedness. So using the ventilators as an example, if a state knows that they are at high risk because of population density, for example, and that they would require that kind of equipment, certainly it would be incumbent upon them to do the best they could to ensure that they had as many of those resources available as possible and ready for deployment as needed. So what we're seeing right now with FEMA is already working around the clock to get resources all over this country. And they're doing the best they can with the resources they have. But I think it's important to state that ultimate responsibility falls on state and local government to ensure that they are prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're kind of bumping up on our time here, but I do want to reiterate what Kamala just said. You know, I've had my arguments with FEMA, just like I've had my arguments with Kamala and the state over the years, but I am here to tell you, those state EOCs and FEMA, they are operating nonstop. They are looking for resources. They're managing resources. They're tracking expenses. And, you know, those are some of the hidden heroes behind all this that are keeping things moving. And hats off to FEMA, because until you've seen a FEMA warehouse and you've seen all that they do, all the people involved, all the reservists they have, they just do a great job. So, Brent, we forgetting anything?
I don't think so. I really appreciate the fact that we've had the opportunity to be here and let people know what's going on. I want to thank you, Kamala, for your comments, your expertise, and for agreeing to have your face put on the video.
Thank you.
So,
and let's remind
Dick,
everybody, if you need more information, the scroll on the bottom, allthingsfirstnet.com. That's our website. This video will be available, obviously, on Facebook, and put it out through YouTube and on our website. Kamala is part of an organization that does help state and local governments with grants that are focused on FirstNet. So for more information, go to the website. And again, thank you, Kamala, for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate it again. Thanks. And I think with that, we'll close this out. Thank everybody that is watching in for watching in. And if not, watch it later on. It'll be there. Thanks.